The convoy rolled through the Iraqi desert at precisely 42 miles per hour, and Lieutenant Kira Thorne kept her hands steady on the wheel even though she could feel every pair of eyes on her from the vehicles behind. They were always watching, always waiting for her to prove Staff Sergeant Garrett Hollis right. Women don't belong behind the wheel of combat convoys. Women are liabilities. Women get people killed. Kira adjusted her grip on the MRAP's steering wheel and ignored the static crackling through her headset. The vehicle handled like a brick with anger management issues, but she'd driven worse. She'd learned to handle her grandfather's ancient Ford pickup on Montana back roads when she was 12, sliding through mud and ice before her feet could properly reach the pedals. This was just metal and momentum. This was simple. What wasn't simple was the way Hollis's voice cut through the radio every 15 minutes with some new observation about her driving. Too slow around corners. Too cautious on straightaways. Too female for the job, though he never quite said that part out loud where command could hear it. The sun hammered down on the windshield, turning the desert into a shimmering pool of heat distortion. Kira squinted against the glare and mentally calculated the distance to Cop Sanctuary. Another 78 kilometers. Another 2 hours of this. Another 2 hours of proving herself to men who had already decided she couldn't. In the passenger seat, Corporal Eli Branford shifted his rifle and glanced over at her. He was 21 and built like a scarecrow, all knees and elbows and nervous energy. He was also the only person in the entire transport unit who had ever asked her a question that wasn't designed to make her feel small. The radio crackled again. "Thorne, tighten up that interval. You're leaving too much space between vehicles." Hollis's voice. Always Hollis's voice. Kira keyed her mic. "Maintaining safe distance per SOP, Staff Sergeant. I'll decide what's safe. Close it up." She eased off the accelerator just slightly, let the distance collapse by a few meters. Enough to satisfy him. Not enough to actually compromise safety. It was a dance she had learned to perform without thinking, this constant negotiation between doing her job correctly and doing it in a way that wouldn't give him ammunition. Branford looked at her again, his voice not carrying beyond the cab. "He doesn't know what he's talking about. You drive better than half the guys in the unit." Kira kept her eyes on the road. Half isn't good enough. The convoy stretched out ahead of her like a metal centipede. 14 vehicles carrying supplies and personnel to the smaller outposts scattered across Anbar province. Routine mission, low threat assessment. The kind of run that should have been boring, except nothing was ever truly boring when you were surrounded by people hoping you'd fail. The truth was lodged somewhere behind Kira's breastbone, heavy and sharp. The truth about who her father had been, what he had taught her, why she could read terrain and calculate wind drift, an estimate range almost as naturally as breathing. But the truth was a locked box, and she had buried the key somewhere in the Montana dirt 17 years ago when they folded the flag and handed it to her mother, a flag for a father she would never meet. "Thorne, you're drifting left." The radio crackled with Hollis's assessment again. Kira corrected smoothly, muscle memory taking over. The MRAP rumbled, back into perfect alignment. She hadn't been drifting. He was testing her. He was always testing her. In her personal gear, locked in a hard case secured beneath her seat with paracord and padlocks, was a rifle her father had built by hand. Custom barrel, match-grade trigger, scope calibrated to distances that would make most soldiers blink in disbelief. She had not touched it since arriving in Iraq 9 months ago, had not told anyone it existed. It was a relic from a different version of herself, from a girl who had learned to thread bullets through prairie wind at ranges most people couldn't see with the naked eye. That girl was gone. That girl had died with her father, not on some distant battlefield, but on a rainy Tuesday at Fort Bragg when a convoy truck lost control and rolled 3 times. Training accident. No enemy fire. No glory. Just physics in bad weather, and a father who had been rushing to get home early because his wife had just called to tell him she was pregnant. He'd been racing to meet his unborn child. Instead, he'd left behind a rifle built for whoever carries my name next, and a legacy that would define a daughter he'd never hold. Now there was only this, the grinding monotony of proving she could drive a truck without embarrassing the uniform. The radio went quiet for a blessed moment. Kira watched the road unpool ahead, watched the heat shimmer off the asphalt, watched the rocky hills rise in the distance. Somewhere in the back of her mind, her father's voice whispered the way it always did when she was stressed. Not a real memory, but something constructed from recordings her mother had played, from stories other Marines had told. "Breathe, Kira. Control what you can control. Let the rest go." She breathed. She controlled the wheel, the speed, the distance. She let Hollis's contempt slide off like water. Branford cleared his throat. Can I ask you something? Depends on the question. Why did you request deployment here? I mean, you could have stayed stateside, could have trained new drivers at Camp Lejeune. Why Iraq? Kira considered the question, considered the real answer, considered how much truth she was willing to offer. Because my father served here, she said finally. Desert Storm 1991. Because I wanted to understand what he saw, what he did. Why the war changed him even though he never came home from it. That was true enough. It was also incomplete. The whole truth was messier, tangled up in grief and guilt, and the desperate need to prove something to a dead man who could no longer hear her. A man who died never knowing she existed. The convoy rolled on. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, all sand and stone, and the occasional burnt-out vehicle rusting slowly under the relentless sun. Kira kept her hands steady. She did her job. She ignored the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. The radio crackled to life again, but this time it wasn't Hollis. It was the convoy commander, Major Reynolds. All vehicles be advised. Intel is picking up increased chatter about our route. Nothing specific, but stay sharp. Kira felt something shift in her chest, some old instinct waking up after months of forced sleep. She scanned the terrain ahead with new eyes, looking for angles and approaches for places where trouble could hide. The hills to the east offered elevation. The wadi to the west offered cover. The bridge ahead was a natural choke point. The memory of her father's teaching surfaced quieter but insistent. Trust your instincts, Kira. If something feels wrong, it probably is. She keyed her mic. So request permission to reduce speed approaching the bridge. I don't like how exposed we are. Negative Thorn. We're on schedule. Maintain current pace. She wanted to argue, wanted to explain that her gut was screaming at her, that every lesson her father had taught her through her mother's patient instruction was lighting up warning signals in her brain. But she was just a driver. Just a woman who was lucky to have this job at all if you asked Hollis. Just the lieutenant who needed to follow orders and keep her mouth shut. Kira eased off the accelerator anyway, just slightly. Enough to buy herself a few extra seconds of reaction time. Not enough to trigger another reprimand. The bridge loomed ahead, concrete and rebar spanning a dry riverbed. Routine. Nothing unusual. Just another bridge on just another convoy route they had run a dozen times before. Kira's hands tightened on the wheel. Something was wrong. She could feel it the way she used to feel weather changes back home, a pressure in the air that meant storms were coming. The radio crackled one more time. All vehicles, we have confirmation of hostile movement in sector. Threat level elevated to moderate. Maintain formation and proceed with caution. Kira's heart kicked against her ribs. Moderate threat. That meant possible contact. That meant the next few minutes could turn from routine to chaos in the space of a heartbeat. She glanced at Branford. He had gone pale, his knuckles white where they gripped his rifle. You good? She asked quietly. Yeah, I'm good. I knew. He was lying, but that was fine. Everyone lied about being scared. It was expected. The convoy rolled toward the bridge. Kira watched the hills, watched the shadows, watched for anything out of place, any hint of what her instincts were screaming about. And in the locked case beneath her seat, her father's rifle waited patient and silent for a moment that might never come. 9 months earlier, Kira Thorne had arrived at FOB Ramadi with a plan: be invisible, be competent but unremarkable, do the job well enough to avoid criticism, not so well that anyone would look too closely. It had worked mostly. Her safety record was perfect. Her vehicle maintenance scores were the highest in the battalion. She showed up on time, followed orders, and never caused problems. The ideal soldier if you ignored the fact that Staff Sergeant Garrett Hollis seemed personally offended by her existence. The morning she received her deployment orders to the convoy unit, Kira had sat alone in her quarters and stared at the locked rifle case she'd brought from home. Her mother had begged her not to bring it. Leave it here, she'd said, tears in her eyes. Leave him here. Go serve as yourself, not as his ghost. But Kira couldn't leave it. The rifle was the last thing her father had built, the last piece of him that existed in the world. Master Gunnery Sergeant Brennan Thorne had spent 6 months in 1989 building that rifle custom fitting, every component for a child he didn't yet know he would have. He'd sealed it with a note before deploying to Kuwait for whoever carries my name next. He died in a training accident at Fort Bragg in March 1991, 3 months before Kira was born in June. Never knowing he would have a daughter, never knowing that his wife would raise that daughter on stories of his courage, teaching her to shoot with the rifle he'd built for whoever carries my name next. Kira had grown up with a father who existed only in photographs and other people's memories. A ghost she'd spent her whole life trying to understand. Colonel Wade Mackenzie had been at that funeral, her mother had told her. Tall, weathered, wearing the same haunted expression all the Desert Storm veterans seemed to carry. Years later, when Kira was old enough to understand, her mother had shared what Mackenzie had said. Your father was the bravest Marine I ever served with. He would have been so proud of the daughter he never got to meet. The morning of her first convoy brief at FOB Ramadi, Kira had arrived early, hoping to blend into the background. Instead, she'd found Colonel Mackenzie waiting in the briefing room, older now, but still carrying that same presence. He gestured to an empty chair. Lieutenant Thorne, sit. She'd sat mind racing. Did he remember her mother? Had he known about her? Your mother called me before your deployment, he'd said without preamble. He slid a photograph across the table, a young Marine in desert camouflage rifle, smoking eyes locked on something in the distance. I was your father's spotter, Kuwait, 1991. I watched him make an 1,800-meter shot across burning oil fields. Kira's throat had tightened. Sir, I'd prefer not to discuss. I won't tell anyone who you are, but Lieutenant Thorne, I need you to understand something. Mackenzie's voice had dropped to almost a whisper. The enemy gets a vote. Someday they'll force your hand. When that day comes, don't hesitate. Your father never did. I came here to drive trucks, sir. You came here to hide from a legacy you think you can't match. Mackenzie had leaned back in his chair. Your father carried 58 confirmed kills. Carried the weight of them until the day he died. You think becoming invisible honors him? I think staying alive without comparison honors him. There are worse things than comparison, Lieutenant, like watching Marines die because you chose invisibility over duty. What Mackenzie hadn't told her then, what he would only reveal months later, was the full story of her father's death. How Brennan Thorne had been rushing home that rainy Tuesday, pushing the convoy too hard in bad weather, desperate to get back early. How his wife had called that morning to tell him she was pregnant. How he'd lost control on a slick road and the truck had rolled 3 times. He'd been racing to meet his unborn child. Instead, he'd left behind a legacy that would haunt that child for 27 years. The words had haunted Kira for 9 months. Every convoy run, every time Hollis questioned her competence. Every night when she lay in her bunk and stared at the locked rifle case and wondered if she was honoring her father's memory or running from it. Now approaching this bridge with her instincts screaming danger, Kira finally understood what Mackenzie had meant. The enemy was about to get their vote. The convoy crossed the bridge without incident. Kira felt the tension drain from her shoulders as the last vehicle cleared the span, felt foolish for letting her instincts override common sense. Nothing had happened. Nothing was going to happen. She was just a driver getting spooked by routine intel chatter, proving Hollis right about women being too emotional for combat roles. Branford exhaled slowly beside her. See, nothing to worry about. Kira nodded but kept scanning the terrain. Her mother had taught her what her father used to say: the absence of an attack didn't mean the absence of a threat. It just meant the threat was patient. They rolled through a small village, mud brick buildings clustered along the road like brown teeth. The radio crackled with Reynolds' voice. Reduce speed to 30. Stay sharp through the village. Kira eased off the accelerator, scanned the buildings for movement for anything out of place. A few locals watched from doorways, their faces carefully neutral. Children played in the dust. An old man sat in the shade smoking. Normal. Everything looked normal. They cleared the village without incident. The road stretched ahead, again empty and shimmering in the heat. Kira's shoulders began to relax slightly. That was when she saw it. Just a flash of light from the eastern ridge. There and gone so fast she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. Sunlight reflecting off glass or metal or a scope. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. She keyed her mic. Actual, this is Alpha 1. Possible glint on Eastern Ridge grid, November Delta 7742. Say again, Alpha 1. Possible observation post, Eastern Ridge. Request permission to increase speed. Negative, Alpha 1, maintain current pace. Hollis, check it out. There was a pause. Then Hollis responded, irritation bleeding through every word. I see no glint. I see no movement. Thorne, you need to settle down. Kira's hands tightened on the wheel. I saw something, Staff Sergeant. You saw sunlight on a rock. Stop jumping at shadows and drive the vehicle. The radio clicked off. Kira forced herself to breathe, slowly forced the tension out of her shoulders. Maybe Hollis was right. Maybe she was seeing threats that didn't exist. Maybe the weight of responsibility was making her paranoid. But the memory of her father's training, channeled through her mother's patient repetition of his lessons, whispered in the back of her mind. Trust your eyes, Kira. If you saw it, you saw it. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Branford glanced over at her. I believe you for what it's worth. Thanks, but believing me doesn't change anything if command thinks I'm paranoid. The convoy rolled on. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Nothing happened. The eastern ridge remained silent and still. Kira began to feel foolish, began to think Hollis was right about her being too emotional, too quick to imagine danger. Then the radio erupted with noise. All vehicles. Vehicles. We have confirmation of enemy movement. Multiple personnel observed on Eastern Ridge and in Western Wadi. This is not a drill. Gunners, weapons hot. Drivers maintain formation and speed. Kira's breath caught. She had been right. She had seen the glint. She had called it out. And Hollis had dismissed her. Something hot and angry flared in her chest, but she pushed it down. No time for vindication, no time for anything except doing her job and keeping everyone alive. The convoy accelerated slightly, not running, but moving with purpose. Kira kept her spacing perfect, kept her speed steady, kept scanning for threats. The gunners in the turrets swiveled their weapons, tracking the high ground. All units be advised. Possible IED reported en route ahead. Slow to 20 and stay center of road. Kira complied, her eyes searching the asphalt for disturbances, for anything that looked wrong. The road curved ahead, following the natural contour of the dry riverbed, and that was when she saw the second bridge. It was smaller than the first one they'd crossed. Just a simple concrete span over a wadi that probably ran with water maybe 3 weeks out of the year. But something about it made every alarm in Kira's head go off at once. The approach was too perfect. The sightlines were too clear. The wadi offered too much cover. If she were planning an ambush, this is exactly where she would do it. Actual, this is Alpha 1. Request alternate route. This bridge is a perfect kill zone. Negative Alpha 1. This is the only route, no alternates available. Proceed with caution. Sir, I strongly advise we find another way. There is no other way, Thorne. Major Reynolds' voice was firm but not unkind. We're committed. Take it slow and stay alert. Kira's hands were slick with sweat inside her gloves. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to turn around, to refuse. But she was a lieutenant, not a commander. She was a driver, not a tactician. Her job was to follow orders. She approached the bridge at 15 miles per hour, her eyes scanning everything in the wadi below the ridges on either side the bridge itself, looking for wires, for disturbances in the dirt, for anything that would give away an ambush. Branford had gone completely silent beside her, his breathing shallow and fast. The front wheels touched the bridge. The structure felt solid beneath them. Kira kept moving smooth and steady, fighting every urge to floor the accelerator and sprint across. Halfway across. 3/4. Almost there. The rear wheels left the bridge and touched solid ground on the far side. Kira exhaled slowly. Alpha 1 across. Copy Alpha 1. Bravo 2 proceed. One by one the vehicles crossed. Each time Kira watched in her mirror, watched for the flash of an explosion, for the eruption of gunfire. But the bridge remained quiet. The wadi remained empty. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe her instincts were rusty, corrupted by 9 months of refusing to use them. Maybe Hollis was right, and she was just a paranoid driver, seeing threats in every shadow. The last vehicle cleared the bridge. The convoy regrouped on the far side, continuing down the road at increased speed now that the choke point was behind them. Hollis's voice came over the radio, directed at her vehicle specifically. See, Thorne, sometimes a bridge is just a bridge. Try not to call in false alarms. It makes the real threats harder to identify. Kira didn't respond, just kept driving, kept scanning, kept doing her job while swallowing the bitter taste of being dismissed. 30 minutes later, the convoy was moving through more open terrain when the radio crackled with a new voice. Actual, this is Overwatch. We have eyes on enemy forces repositioning. Approximately 20 personnel moving to intercept convoy route. They're setting up in grid November Delta 7743. Kira's hands tightened on the wheel. That grid was less than 5 kilometers ahead, right where the road narrowed through a rocky pass. All vehicles increase speed to 50. We're going to push through before they can set up. Drivers maintain tight formation. Kira pressed the accelerator. The MRAP surged forward, the engine roaring around her. The convoy tightened up, vehicles moving faster now, racing against time and terrain, and an enemy that was somewhere ahead waiting. Branford chambered around, his face pale but set. If this goes bad, what do I do? You stay low and you trust me to drive us out of it, Kira said. That's all you can do. What will you do? Kira thought about the rifle locked in its case beneath her seat, Thought about the thousands of rounds she had fired in training under her mother's watchful eye, learning skills her father had never lived to teach her directly. Thought about everything he had left behind. My job, she said. I'll do my job. The rocky pass loomed ahead, the road narrowing to barely 2 lanes between steep hillsides covered in boulders and scrub. Exactly what the enemy wanted. The convoy plunged into the pass at full speed, engines screaming, dust billowing behind them. Kira's world narrowed to the road ahead and the vehicles beside her and the growing certainty that everything was about to go very wrong, very fast. All units, enemy contact imminent. Prepare for engagement. Kira's breath came steady despite the hammering of her heart. Her hands were rock solid on the wheel. Whatever happened next, she would be ready. She had trained for this her entire life, even if her father had never lived to see it. She just hoped she remembered how. The convoy burst through the rocky pass and nothing happened. No gunfire, no explosions, just dust and engine noise and the pounding of Kira's heart against her ribs. She kept her foot steady on the accelerator, kept scanning the hillsides, kept waiting for the world to explode. 1 kilometer through the pass, then 2. The rocky walls began to open up, revealing wider terrain beyond. All units, Overwatch reports enemy forces have not engaged. They appear to be holding position. Maintain speed and clear the area. Kira's shoulders remained locked with tension. Something felt wrong about this. Enemy forces don't reposition to intercept a convoy and then just let it pass. They were waiting for something, or they had moved to a different position. This was never the real ambush site. Her mind raced through possibilities, calculating angles and approaches the way her mother had taught her from her father's tactical notebooks. If she wanted to hit a convoy that knew she was coming, where would she set up? Not in the obvious choke point. Somewhere after, somewhere they would relax, somewhere they would think they were safe. Hollis took command, his voice cutting through the chaos with parade ground authority. Good job maintaining formation through the pass, drivers. Thorne, you didn't panic. Progress. The words should have felt like acknowledgement. Instead, they felt like condescension wrapped in false praise. Kira keyed her mic. Thank you, Staff Sergeant. Maybe I was wrong about you freezing under pressure. Maybe you can handle this after all. Kira didn't respond, let him think what he wanted. She had more important things to focus on, like the fact that her instincts were still screaming that danger was close. Branford finally exhaled, lowering his rifle slightly. That was intense. Thought for sure we were going to get hit back there. We still might, Kira kept her eyes moving. Just because we cleared the pass doesn't mean we're safe. You really don't relax, do you? My father used to say that relaxing in a combat zone is how you end up dead. Kira shifted her grip on the wheel. Stay alert until you're back inside the wire. Even then, stay alert. Sounds exhausting. It is, but it keeps you alive. The convoy rolled into more open terrain, the road straightening out across a broad plain dotted with scattered rocks and dry vegetation. The kind of ground that offered no cover, no concealment. The kind of ground that should have felt safer. Kira's unease grew stronger. Too open, too exposed, too perfect for long-range observation. Her mind automatically calculated distances. If someone were watching from that low ridge to the north, they would have clear sight lines for at least 3 kilometers. If they had a decent scope, they could count the rivets on the vehicles. If they had a radio, they could call in positions to forces elsewhere. Stop it, she told herself again. You're not a scout. You're not your father. You're just a driver who needs to stop seeing ghosts. But the ghosts wouldn't go away. They whispered in a voice constructed from recordings and other people's memories, patient and insistent. Pay attention, Kira. The enemy gets a vote. They're planning something. Figure out what. She scanned the terrain with new intensity, looking for what didn't belong. A vehicle that shouldn't be there, a reflection of glass, movement where there should be none. This is Alpha 1, requesting permission to increase speed to 60. I don't like how exposed we are. Negative Alpha 1, maintain current speed. We're not racing across a rock. We're projecting confidence and control. Kira wanted to argue that projecting confidence was meaningless if you projected it straight into an ambush. But she was learning that being right didn't matter if nobody wanted to hear it. The convoy maintained its steady pace, 45 miles per hour across open ground. Professional, disciplined, predictable. Predictable was dangerous. Branford shifted in his seat, checking his rifle for the 3rd time in as many minutes. Can I ask you something personal? Depends on the question. Your father, the one who taught you to drive, was he deployed here? Kira was quiet for a moment, weighing how much truth to offer. He was. Desert Storm 1991. But he never came home to tell me about it. What do you mean? He died in a training accident 3 months before I was born. Everything I know about him comes from my mother's stories and other Marines who served with him. Branford absorbed that. So you never met him? Never. But I grew up trying to understand him anyway. Kira kept her eyes on the road. My mother taught me everything he would have taught by using his notebooks, his techniques. Like if I learned what he knew, maybe I'd understand the man I never got to meet. Did it work? Do you understand? No. Kira's voice was soft. I understand the skills. I don't understand what using them did to him, what it cost him, what weight he carried that made my mother say he came back from Desert Storm different than when he deployed. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe some things are better not understood. Maybe. The convoy rolled on. The sun climbed higher, baking the desert into shimmering stillness. Kira's shirt was soaked with sweat beneath her body armor. Her hands ached from gripping the wheel. Her eyes burned from constant scanning. And then she saw it again. Another flash of light. This time from a different position, northeast, maybe 800 meters distant. There for half a second, then gone. Her pulse spiked. Actual, this is Alpha 1. Glint Northeast Grid, November Delta 7750. There was a pause, then his tone shifted, going cold and dismissive. Thorne, I'm looking at that grid right now. There is nothing there. Staff Sergeant, I saw a reflection. Glass or metal or... You saw heat shimmer. You saw mirage. You saw your own paranoia. His words carried an edge. Stop calling in false contacts. You're making the gunners jumpy. Kira's jaw clenched. It wasn't heat shimmer. It was glass or metal or something reflective. She knew the difference. She had spent years learning to read terrain through a scope under her mother's patient instruction, learning to distinguish real threats from environmental noise. But she was just a driver, and the driver's opinion on threat assessment didn't matter. Copy, Staff Sergeant, she said through gritted teeth. Branford looked over at her. I believe you saw something. Oh, believing me doesn't change anything. Then stop telling them what you see. Just react if something happens. Kira shook her head. That's how people die. You see a threat, you call it in. Even if nobody listens. Even if it gets you labeled paranoid. Even then. The convoy continued across the open plain. 20 minutes passed without incident. Then 30. Kira began to wonder if Hollis was right, if she was seeing threats that didn't exist, if 9 months away from real training had corrupted her judgment. But the knot in her stomach wouldn't loosen. Something was wrong. Something was coming. She could feel it the way animals feel earthquakes before they hit. All units be advised. Overwatch has lost visual on enemy forces. Last known position was Grid November Delta 7743, but they're no longer there. Assume they have repositioned. Stay alert. The radio went quiet. Every vehicle in the convoy seemed to tighten up, gunners swiveling their weapons more rapidly, scanning for threats that could be anywhere. Kira's mind raced. 20 personnel don't just disappear. They move. They reposition. They find better ground. If she were moving those forces, where would she go? Not behind the convoy that gave up the advantage. Not to the flanks in this open terrain that left them exposed. Forward. She would move them forward to a place where the convoy would have to slow down or stop. A place with cover and concealment and multiple escape routes. Her eyes locked on the terrain ahead. 3 kilometers distant, the road began to curve around a series of low hills. Not dramatic terrain, but enough to break sight lines. Enough to hide forces in the dead ground behind the hills. That's where I would go, she thought. That's where I would set the trap. She keyed her mic. She'll request permission to reduce speed approaching the curve ahead. Terrain offers ideal ambush positions. Thorne, Hollis cut in before the commander could respond. Stop second-guessing the route. We've driven this road a dozen times. There's nothing special about that curve. With respect, Staff Sergeant, we've never driven it with confirmed enemy forces actively maneuvering against us. We've also never driven it with a driver who sees an ambush behind every rock. His words carried mockery now. Just drive, Thorne. Let the professionals handle threat assessment. The words hit like a slap. Professionals. As if her training didn't count. As if her years learning from a legendary Marine Scout sniper's preserved knowledge meant nothing because she had chosen to be a driver instead of following in his footsteps. As if growing up studying her father's tactical notebooks and shooting journals meant she couldn't read terrain. Kira's hands tightened on the wheel until her knuckles went white. She wanted to key the mic and tell Hollis exactly what kind of professional she was. Wanted to explain that she could read terrain better than half the scouts in the battalion because her mother had spent 17 years teaching her everything Brennan Thorne had known. Wanted to prove that her instincts weren't paranoia, but hard-earned skill passed down from a father she'd never met. But she swallowed it all, buried it deep, because proving herself meant revealing herself. And revealing herself meant confronting everything she had been running from for 27 years. The convoy approached the curve. Kira reduced speed slightly anyway, just enough to buy reaction time. Just enough to go against Hollis's dismissal in the smallest way possible. Branford gripped his rifle tighter. How bad is this going to be? I don't know, Kira said honestly, but stay low and hold on. The lead vehicle entered the curve. The road bent around the first hill, sightlines collapsing from kilometers to meters. Kira's every sense screamed warning. And then the world turned to fire and thunder and screaming metal as the IED detonated under Vehicle 6 and the ambush opened up from both sides like the jaws of a trap that had been waiting for them all along. The explosion lifted Vehicle 6 off the ground and dropped it on its hood like a discarded toy. Kira felt the shockwave slam into her MRAP. Felt the vehicle shudder, heard Branford shouting something she couldn't process over the ringing in her ears. Training took over. She yanked the wheel hard right, moving off the road to give the vehicles behind maneuvering room, and slammed the transmission into park. Contact IED, Vehicle 6 is down, someone was screaming over the radio. Multiple casualties, we need medevac now. The world sharpened into crystal clarity. Smoke billowed from the overturned MRAP. The vehicle behind it had stopped hard soldiers already dismounting. And from the hills on both sides of the road, muzzle flashes erupted like deadly fireflies. All units, we are under fire. Return fire and establish security perimeter. Hollis took command of the chaos. Gunners engage targets on the high ground. Drivers stay with vehicles. Kira's hands moved automatically, grabbing the case from beneath her seat, her fingers working the combination lock with muscle memory older than her service record. 17 years of opening this case. 17 years of maintaining her father's final gift. Beside her, Branford was pale but focused his weapon up and tracking toward the hills. Thorne, I said, stay with your vehicle. The order came sharp over the radio. Kira keyed her mic. Roger, staying with vehicle. But her hands were already opening the case, already lifting out the rifle her father had built 36 years ago for a daughter he would never meet. Branford stared. Well, to what? How long have you? Where did that come from? Kira chambered around, feeling the familiar click of the bolt sliding home. The rifle felt like coming home to a place she'd never been. Tell Hollis I'm taking overwatch position. Don't ask questions. Just do it. She was out of the vehicle before Branford could argue, moving low and fast toward a cluster of rocks 40 meters from the road. The position offered decent cover and a clear sightline to the eastern ridge. Not perfect, but it would have to do. Behind her, she heard Branford keying the radio. Staff Sergeant Hollis, you need to know that Lieutenant Thorne just grabbed a rifle I've never seen before and is setting up a shooting position. What? Hollis's voice exploded over the radio. Thorne, get back to your vehicle right now. Kira ignored him. She was already settling into her shooting position, rifle braced on a rock scope coming up to her eye. Everything her mother had taught her. Everything her father had designed this rifle to do. The world narrowed to the circle of glass, to the magnified image of the hillside 800 meters distant. There, two insurgents behind a boulder cluster. One with an RPG, one with a rifle. They were the primary threat to the downed vehicle. Take them out, and the convoy could move. Thorne, I gave you a direct order. Return to your vehicle immediately. Kira tuned out everything except the fundamentals her father had designed into this rifle. The fundamentals her mother had drilled into her 10,000 times. Breathing, trigger control, wind reading, range estimation. She checked the mirage rising off the desert floor, estimated wind speed at 8 miles per hour from the southwest. Dialed elevation into her scope. Adjusted for the cant of her rifle. The insurgent with the RPG shifted position, preparing to fire. 3 seconds until he launched. 2 seconds. 1. Kira's finger pressed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The familiar crack of the shot echoed across the desert. 800 meters away, the insurgent with the RPG dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The second insurgent froze, confused, looking around for the source of the shot. Kira worked the bolt, chambered another round, acquired the target, pressed the trigger. The second man fell. The Tedu went silent. Complete shock silence. Then Hollis's voice strangled in disbelieving. What the hell was that? Kira didn't answer. She was already scanning for the next threat. Found a cluster of 3 fighters in a different position, 600 meters out. They were firing down at the convoy with AK-47s, their rounds stitching the dirt around the wounded vehicle. She took the first one with a shot to center mass, worked the bolt, took the second before he could process what was happening. The third tried to run. She led him by 2 feet and dropped him mid-stride. Thorn, Hollis's voice had changed completely. "Who the hell are you?" Kira acquired another target, fired, reloaded, fired again. "Someone who should have spoken up sooner, Staff Sergeant." The insurgent fire from the eastern ridge began to falter. The fighters who remained were going to ground, trying to figure out where the precision fire was coming from. Good. Let them be confused. Let them be scared. Kira shifted her aim to the western positions. Closer but still 500 meters out. Harder shots because of the angle, but her father had built this rifle for exactly these conditions. Her mother had taught her exactly how to use it. She found a man crouched behind a rock wall, just his head and rifle visible. Calculated the hold. Accounted for the crosswind. Squeezed the trigger. The man's rifle clattered down the hillside as he collapsed. Major Reynolds' voice came over the radio sharp with urgency. "Unknown shooter, identify yourself." "Lieutenant Kira Thorne, sir, driver Alpha 1, providing precision fire support." "Thorne, what are your qualifications?" Kira fired again. Another insurgent down. "My father was Master Gunnery Sergeant Brennan Thorne, Marine Scout Sniper. He built this rifle for me before I was born. My mother trained me using his methods from age 6. I can make these shots, sir." There was a pause. Then Reynolds' voice filled with something between amazement and anger. "Then keep making them, Lieutenant. All units, Thorne has overwatch. Suppress western positions while she clears the east ridge." The convoy's gunners adjusted their fire, concentrating on the western hills. Kira focused on the eastern positions, methodically eliminating threats one by one. Each shot was a conversation with a father she'd never met. Each trigger press a continuation of lessons learned through her mother's patient instruction, channeling knowledge from a man who died never knowing she existed. Each perfect function of this custom-built rifle was evidence of a father's love expressed through steel and glass and mathematics. This was what he had prepared for. This was why he had spent 6 months in 1989 building a rifle for a child he didn't know he'd have. This was who she really was. 5 targets down, 8, 12. The insurgent fire slackened dramatically as the fighters on the eastern ridge either died or retreated. The pressure on the convoy eased enough for soldiers to rush forward and begin extracting the wounded from the overturned vehicle. Kira kept shooting, kept scanning, kept doing what she had been born to do. And in the back of her mind, beneath the focus and the adrenaline and the cold efficiency of trained violence, she felt something she'd never felt before. Connection. Not to a memory or a story or a photograph, but to the man who'd built this rifle knowing someday, somehow it would save lives he'd never see. "There's my girl," she'd imagined him saying. "I knew you would remember." The ambush broke. The surviving insurgents melted away into the hills, their attacks shattered by a threat they had not anticipated: a single shooter who could reach out across impossible distances and touch them with precision they could not match. The convoy began to reorganize. Medevac birds were inbound. The wounded were being stabilized. And Lieutenant Kira Thorne, the driver who was just supposed to stay with her vehicle and follow orders, had just saved the entire convoy with skills inherited from a father she'd never met. Hollis appeared beside her position, his face unreadable. "We need to talk, Thorne, right now." Staff Sergeant Garrett Hollis stared at Lieutenant Kira Thorne like she had just spoken a foreign language he couldn't quite parse. His expression cycled through shock, anger, and something that might have been respect, struggling to break through years of certainty. She had spent 9 months under his command being dismissed as inadequate, and now she had just demonstrated skills that most of his security team couldn't match. 15 confirmed kills, Lieutenant. His voice was carefully controlled. Eastern ridge is clear. Western positions are suppressed. Convoy can maneuver. Kira, safe her rifle, remained in position, scanning for additional threats. The smoke from Vehicle 6 billowed black against the blue sky. Medics were working on the wounded, their movements urgent but controlled. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Hollis gestured at the hillside where bodies lay scattered among the rocks. "Those were shots at 800 meters, plus under combat stress, with a rifle I've never seen you carry. You made those shots like you've been doing this your entire life." "I have been," Kira said quietly, "just not in uniform." Major Reynolds appeared jogging over from the command vehicle. His face was grim, but his eyes held a sharp intelligence that made Kira straighten her posture. "Thorne, I need a full explanation. Now." Kira met his gaze without flinching. "Sir, my father was Master Gunnery Sergeant Brennan Thorne. He served Desert Storm as a Marine Scout sniper. He was killed in a training accident in March 1991, 3 months before I was born. She paused, let that sink in. He never knew he'd have a daughter, but before he deployed, he built this rifle for whoever carries my name next. My mother raised me on his legacy, taught me everything he would have taught me using his notebooks and training methods. By the time I was 17, I was competing at national level matches and placing top 5. Reynolds' eyes narrowed. And you enlisted as a driver. Why? Because I promised my mother I would serve. Kira's voice remained controlled, but something beneath it cracked slightly. I just couldn't face Scout Sniper School without ever having known him. Couldn't handle everyone comparing me to a legend I'd only met through stories. So I chose a different path. I thought I could honor his memory without becoming him. By hiding your skills, Reynolds said flatly. By letting us think you were just a competent driver when you were actually one of the most qualified shooters in this battalion. Kira had no response to that. It was the truth, stark and undeniable. Hollis stepped forward, his face flushed. Sir, with respect, this is a serious breach of trust. Thorne has been lying to us for 9 months, withholding information about her capabilities, making us think she was something she's not. She also just saved 14 lives, Hollis. Reynolds' voice was sharp, including yours. I watched her drop targets our gunners couldn't touch. I watched her break an ambush that could have destroyed this convoy. So before you start talking about breaches of trust, maybe consider what just happened. Sir, I understand that. But we have a right to know who we're serving with. What else is she hiding? Nothing, Kira said. There's nothing else. I can shoot. That's the only secret I've been keeping. Reynolds studied her for a long moment. What was your longest confirmed shot in competition? 1,467 meters. Wind was gusting 12 to 15 miles per hour. I placed first in my division. And in combat just now, what was your longest shot? 847 meters. The man with the RPG on the eastern ridge. Reynolds whistled softly. Thorne, do you understand what you've done here? You've just demonstrated capabilities we desperately need. We have 2 designated marksmen in the battalion, and one of them is currently on a medevac bird with a collapsed lung. We need shooters like you. I'm a driver, sir. You were a driver. Reynolds' voice held finality. As of right now, you're whatever I need you to be. And what I need is someone who can make impossible shots when our backs are against the wall. Kira felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This was what she had been avoiding. This was why she had hidden her skills, buried her training, chosen to be less than she was. Because once people knew what she could do, they would ask her to do it. And doing it meant confronting everything she had lost, not a father taken from her, but a father she'd never had the chance to know at all. Sir, I request permission to continue serving as a driver. Request denied. Reynolds' expression softened slightly. Thorne, I know this isn't what you planned. I know you have your reasons for keeping your head down. But we're in a war zone and soldiers are dying because we don't have enough qualified shooters. You have a gift. Your father gave it to you before you were born, and right now I'm ordering you to use it. The words hit harder than Kira expected. Your father gave it to you before you were born. She looked down at the rifle in her hands, at the weapon her father had designed and built in 1989, custom-fitting every component for a child whose existence was still months away. The rifle that had waited 27 years for her to finally use it the way he'd intended. Maybe she would never be ready. Maybe that was the point. Maybe her father had known that too. Yes, sir, she said quietly. Good. Reynolds turned to Hollis. Staff Sergeant, I want a full inventory of Thorne's equipment and capabilities. Find out what else she's been carrying, and I want her shooting scores documented and sent up the chain. Someone at regiment needs to know we have a natural sniper driving supply trucks. Hollis's jaw was tight, but he nodded. Yes, sir. The major walked away, already keying his radio to coordinate the medevac and reorganization of the convoy. Kira and Hollis stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment, the sound of distant helicopters growing louder. I was wrong about you, Hollis said finally. His voice was rough, like the words were being dragged out against his will. I thought you were weak. Thought you were a liability. Thought having you in the convoy was a mistake. You weren't completely wrong, Kira said. I was hiding. I was being less than I could be. That's its own kind of weakness. No, Hollis shook his head. I was wrong because I judged you without knowing you. I assumed incompetence because of prejudice. That's on me, not you. What you did today, those shots you made, that wasn't weakness. That was elite-level marksmanship under the worst possible conditions. Kira met his eyes. I should have told you. Should have told everyone. Maybe if I had, things would have been different. Or maybe you would have been the one in that vehicle instead of Corporal Martinez. We don't get to play what if. We deal with what is. Branford jogged over, his face split in a grin that looked almost manic. LT, that was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. Seriously, where have you been hiding that? In plain sight, Kira said. Just nobody was looking. Well, I'm looking now. You dropped 15 targets like you were at a shooting range. No misses. It wasn't a game, Branford. Kira's voice went quiet. Those were human beings, even if they were trying to kill us. Branford's smile faded. Right, sorry, I just meant I've never seen shooting like that outside of movies. My father used to say, Kira paused, corrected herself. My mother told me my father used to say that movies get it wrong. Real precision shooting isn't dramatic. It's just math and physics and breathing control. She checked her rifle, safed it, started breaking it down. The hard part isn't making the shot. The hard part is living with having made it. The medevac helicopters touched down in a swirl of dust and noise. Medics rushed to load the wounded, their movements practiced and efficient. Kira watched them work, counted the stretchers, calculated the cost. 6 wounded, 2 critical. All of them would probably survive now because she had finally stopped hiding from a father she'd never known. That was the trade, her secret for their lives. Her comfortable anonymity for the weight of being who her father had designed her to be. She wasn't sure if it was worth it, but she had made the choice, and there was no taking it back. The convoy reorganized over the next 40 minutes. The damaged vehicle was secured for recovery. The formation tightened. The security posture shifted from standard to high alert, and Kira found herself reassigned from lead driver to a position in the middle of the convoy with orders to have her rifle ready in case they hit more resistance. She sat in the passenger seat, now her rifle across her lap, while Hollis himself took the wheel. The reversal felt surreal. 3 hours ago, he had been questioning her competence. Now he was driving for her. You know what the real kicker is, Hollis said as they rolled out. I spent 9 months trying to get you transferred because I thought you would get someone killed. Turns out you're the reason none of us are dead right now. Irony isn't the right word for that. No, Kira said. Humbling is. Hollis glanced at her. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. For doubting you, for undermining you, for being blind to who you actually are. I made it easy for you to be blind. I was trying to be invisible. Why I still don't understand why someone with your skills would choose to hide them. Kira was quiet for a long moment, watching the desert roll past. Because every time I pick up this rifle, I feel my father's presence. Every time I make a shot, I remember my mother teaching me his methods, showing me his notebooks, telling me what he would have done. And every time I remember that he died before I was born, that he never knew I existed, that I'll never hear his voice except through other people's memories. She paused. And I remember that he died rushing home to meet me, that if he hadn't been so eager to learn he was going to be a father, he'd probably still be alive. Hollis drove in silence, absorbing that. Finally, he said, he would be proud of you, what you did today, who you are. Maybe, Kira's voice was barely a whisper, or maybe he would be disappointed that I ran from his legacy for so long. Nobody who saw you shoot today would ever call what you did running. The convoy pushed towards COP Sanctuary, the mission continuing despite the violence. They had supplies to deliver and soldiers waiting who needed them. The ambush had delayed them but not stopped them. As the kilometers rolled past, Kira felt something shifting inside her. A weight she had been carrying for 27 years beginning to lighten. Not disappearing, but becoming bearable. Her father was still gone. That grief was permanent grief for a man she'd never known, never would know. But maybe honoring his memory didn't mean becoming him. Maybe it just meant being willing to use what he had prepared for her even though he'd died before knowing she'd exist to receive it. The radio crackled. All units, Overwatch reports no further enemy activity. Route appears clear to destination. Kira checked her rifle anyway, verified the chamber was clear, the safety engaged, the scope still zeroed. Azerfet. Old habits from a lifetime of training under her mother's watchful eye, learning skills from a ghost. Hollis noticed. You're not taking any chances. My mother told me my father used to say that the fight you're ready for is the fight you'll survive. Kira settled the rifle across her lap. So I stay ready. Smart man, your father. The best. At least that's what everyone tells me. They drove on through the desert, through the heat and dust and the aftermath of violence. Behind them, the hillside held the evidence of what Kara Thorne could do when she stopped hiding. Ahead of them, an uncertain future where her secret was no longer secret and her skills were no longer optional. And somewhere in the space between those 2 points, Kira began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, her father had been preparing her for exactly this moment all along, even though he'd never lived to see her face or know her name. Combat Outpost Sanctuary sat on a barren hilltop like a defiant middle finger raised at the surrounding desert. Concrete barriers, sandbags, and razor wire formed a perimeter that looked more desperate than secure. The convoy rolled through the gate just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Kira of fire. The soldiers at the outpost looked thin and tired, their uniforms dusty and their eyes hollow. They had been isolated for 3 weeks, running low on everything that mattered. The arrival of the convoy brought visible relief to their faces, shoulders straightening slightly as hope returned. Captain Sloane Cross met them at the gate. She was 41 with silver threading through dark hair, pulled back in a tight bun. Her right hand was missing the last 2 fingers, old injury poorly healed. But her eyes were sharp, taking in everything. "Major Reynolds," she said, saluting. "Thank you for the resupply. We were down to our last 3 days of rations." "Captain Cross, glad we could get through." Reynolds gestured to Kira. "This is Lieutenant Thorne. She's the one I briefed you about." Cross turned her attention to Kira, and something flickered in her expression. Recognition, maybe, or assessment. "Lieutenant, heard you broke an ambush today. 15 kills at extended range." "Yes, ma'am." "Your father was Brennan Thorne." It wasn't a question. Kira felt her spine stiffen. "You knew him." "Desert Storm. I was a competitive shooter before I enlisted Olympic alternate in 1988. Your father and I traded techniques during downtime in Kuwait. He was—" Cross paused, choosing her words carefully. "He was the most naturally gifted marksman I ever met, and the one who carried the weight of it hardest." She turned and started walking toward the Tactical Operations Center. "Come on, I need to brief you on our sniper problem." The TOC was a reinforced concrete bunker that smelled of sweat and stale coffee. Cross spread a map across a table scarred with cigarette burns and the rings of countless coffee mugs. 7 KIA over the past 2 weeks, all from precision fire. Ranges we estimate between 1,500 and 1,700 meters. She pulled out photographs, each showing a casualty with a clean entry wound. Every shot center mass, no misses we've detected. This shooter is a professional. Kira studied the photos, her mind automatically analyzing angles and trajectories the way her mother had taught her, and these came from different positions. He's not using the same hide twice. Correct, which makes counter-battery fire useless. By the time we identify a position, he's gone. What about air support? We've tried. He shoots when weather obscures aerial observation or he's positioned where terrain masks him from above. Cross traced her finger across the map. We think he's operating from these 3 general areas, but that's still over 2 square kilometers of broken ground. Kira looked at the terrain elevations marked on the map. He's got advantage on all of them. Higher ground, multiple escape routes defilade from direct fire. Exactly. That's why we need someone who can match him shot for shot. Cross met her eyes. Your father could make those shots. Reynolds says you can too. I've never made a shot over 1,400 meters outside competition. Competition conditions are controlled. This is what your father trained you for, even if he never lived to see it. Cross's voice was gentle but firm. He built that rifle before you were born, Lieutenant. Built it knowing someday someone would need to exceed what he'd done. That someone is you. Kira felt the weight of expectation pressing down. When do I go out? 0300 tomorrow. You'll have 12 hours of darkness to get into position. He typically shoots between 08 and 1200 when heat shimmer makes counter-observation difficult. I'll need to study the terrain maps, wind patterns, historical weather data for this area. Cross smiled slightly. Your father said the same things. TOC is yours for the night. I'll have hot chow sent over. As Cross turned to leave, Kira called after her. Ma'am, what was my father like when you knew him? Cross paused in the doorway. Quiet, methodical, the kind of man who could sit in a hide for 3 days without moving, then make one perfect shot and disappear. She looked back at Kira. But what I remember most was after the shooting, he'd go to the chaplain's tent and sit there for hours. Never said a word, just sat, carried the weight where nobody could see it. She paused. He talked about the baby on the way, the child he was desperate to get home to meet. He didn't know you'd be a girl, but he talked about teaching you everything he knew, about passing on the skills but hoping you'd never need to use them. After Cross left, Kira spread the maps and began the work her father had designed into his notebooks, the notebooks her mother had preserved and taught from. Elevation studies, wind pattern analysis, probable hide positions based on tactical advantage. 3 potential zones where the enemy sniper might be operating, each with multiple possible firing points. She pulled out the notebook she'd been keeping since she was 16, page after page of calculations, wind formulas, ballistic coefficients, range estimations, the mathematics of precision shooting, the language her father had left behind, taught to her by a mother who'd learned it to keep him alive in her daughter's memory. She ran her fingers over the numbers, remembering the way her mother's voice had sounded, explaining trajectory, explaining drift, explaining patience, channeling a husband she'd lost before their daughter was born. You have a gift, Kira. Her mother had told her when she was 16 and had just put 3 rounds through the same hole at 800 yards. Your father built this rifle for you before he knew you were coming. He wanted you to have his skills. Don't waste them hiding from who you are. But what good was a gift if using it meant confronting the fact that he was gone, that he died without ever knowing she'd exist, that she carried a name and a legacy from a man who was nothing more than photographs in other people's stories? A knock at the door. Branford stuck his head in. LT, brought you some food. Figured you might forget to eat. Thanks, Branford. Kira accepted the tray, something that might have been chicken in a previous life with rice and vegetables that had probably been dehydrated 6 months ago. Branford sat down across from her, his own tray in hand. Captain Cross seems intense. She knew my father. Apparently he had a reputation. You never told me your father was a sniper. A famous one from what I'm hearing around the base. Kira poked at her food. I don't like to talk about it. Because he died. Because he died before I was born. Because everyone who knew him has a story, and none of those stories include me. Because I'm supposed to honor the memory of a man I never met, live up to a legacy I only know through secondhand accounts. She set down her fork. And because everyone expects me to be him when I can barely figure out who I am. Branford was quiet for a moment. My sister told me something once. She said the people who scare you most aren't the ones with power. It's the ones who've decided to stop hiding their power. Your sister sounds wise. She's also annoying as hell, but she's right about this. You scared the hell out of everyone today, LT, including yourself, I think. I'm terrified I'm good at this for all the wrong reasons, that I'm just trying to reach a ghost. What would be the right reasons? Kira thought about that. About the wounded soldiers being loaded onto medevacs. About the convoy that had survived because she'd finally stopped hiding. I don't know yet, but I'm going out there tomorrow to find out. After Branford left, Kira returned to the maps, marking distances, calculating fields of fire, preparing for a duel with an enemy she'd never seen who had killed 7 Marines and was waiting for someone good enough to challenge him. Her sat phone buzzed. Encrypted call, Colonel Mackenzie. Lieutenant Thorne heard about the ambush. 15 confirmed kills. Outstanding work. Thank you, sir. I also heard Reynolds is sending you after the sniper at COP Sanctuary. Yes, sir. I leave at 0300. There was a pause. When Mackenzie spoke again, his voice was quieter. Kira, I need to tell you something about your father. Something that was classified until last month. Something your mother asked me to tell you when the time was right. Her hand tightened on the phone. Sir Diana, Desert Storm 1991. Your father's 58 confirmed kills, 34 were Iraqi Republican Guard, but 24 were different. Different how? Soviet advisors, Spetsnaz operating with Iraqi forces, training them in advanced sniper tactics. Mackenzie let that sink in. The sniper you're hunting, we have signals intelligence suggesting foreign fighter. Former Soviet bloc, possibly Chechen or Georgian. Professional military training. Kira's blood ran cold. You think he knows someone's coming? I think he knows we'd send our best, and I think he's prepared for exactly that. Mackenzie paused. Your father faced a Soviet counter-sniper in Kuwait. 3-day duel across the oil fields. Your father won, but barely. Made his record 1876-meter shot on the final day. My mother never told me about that. She didn't know the details until recently. It was classified. Mackenzie's voice carried the weight of old memories. I was his spotter. I watched him miss the first 2 shots, Kira. Took him 3 days to figure out the wind patterns across the burning oil fields. 3 days of the enemy trying to kill him while he learned. 3 days of doubt and fear and calculating. The 3rd shot dropped a Spetsnaz lieutenant who had 17 confirmed kills of his own. Why are you telling me this now? Because you need to know your father wasn't superhuman. He wasn't some legend who never failed. He was a human being who refused to quit when it mattered most. He missed, he doubted, he was terrified. Mackenzie's voice hardened, but he stayed in that hide for 3 days, made the calculations, and took the shot when it counted. That's what made him a legend. Not perfect shooting, perfect commitment. And he did it all while thinking about the child he'd never get to meet you. Your mother was 3 months pregnant when he deployed. He knew about you, Kira. He just didn't know your name or your face. But he knew you existed. Kira felt tears stinging her eyes. He knew about me. He knew, and according to the letters he sent your mother, letters she still has, he spent every night in that hide thinking about what he'd teach you, how he'd keep you safe, what kind of father he wanted to be. Mackenzie's voice softened. He died trying to get home to meet you. That training accident, he was pushing too hard, driving too fast, because your mother had called that morning to tell him she could feel you moving. He wanted to be there for your first kicks. After the call ended, Kira sat in the silence of the TOC, surrounded by maps and calculations, and the ghost of a father who'd known she was coming, but died before seeing her face. She pulled out the photograph she carried her father in desert camouflage, Desert Storm 1991, taken by Mackenzie probably. Young man with old eyes holding a rifle like it was an extension of his body, thinking about a daughter he'd never meet. Everything she knew about him came from other people's stories, from her mother's careful curation of his memory, from the rifle he'd built for a child he'd only known as an abstraction. But now for the first time she had something real, something true. He knew about her, he'd wanted to meet her, he'd died trying to reach her, and he'd built this rifle, his final act before deploying, as a gift for the child he hoped would never need to use it. Kira returned to her maps with new focus. If her father could spend 3 days in a hide while thinking about a daughter he'd never meet, then she could do this, could face this enemy, could honor not just his skills, but his commitment. The enemy sniper out there was professional, trained, experienced, but so was she. And she carried the legacy of a man who had beaten the best the Soviet Union could field, a man who'd fought while dreaming of the child waiting at home. At 0230, Kira began her final preparations. Full ghillie suit constructed from local vegetation. Her father's rifle, the custom build he'd made for her before knowing her name. 72 hours of water and rations. Rangefinder, backup scope, the notebook with her calculations, and the photograph of her father sealed in plastic tucked into her breast pocket. The father who'd known about her, who'd wanted to meet her, who'd died racing toward her. Captain Cross found her in the armory. Lieutenant, final brief before you step off. They walked to a position on the outpost perimeter with a view of the terrain she'd be entering. The desert stretched away into darkness, broken by rock formations and low hills. Your father sat right here in 1991, Cross said quietly, night before his duel with the Soviet sniper. I asked him if he was scared. You know what he said? Kira shook her head. He said being scared meant you understood the stakes. That recklessness was what got you killed. He said he was terrified not of dying, but of dying before he could meet his child. Cross turned to look at her. He talked about you that night, Lieutenant. Didn't know if you'd be a boy or a girl, but he talked about the future, about teaching you to shoot, to hunt, to understand the wind, about hoping you'd be better than him. What if I'm not good enough? Your father asked me the same question that night. You want to know what I told him? What? I told him it didn't matter if he was good enough. It only mattered if he was willing to try when nobody else could. He was doing it for you, for the child waiting at home. That's what made him capable of the impossible. Cross put her hand on Kira's shoulder. 7 Marines died because we didn't have anyone who could make those shots. You can make them. Your father built you that rifle believing you could. That's all that matters. At 0300 exactly, Kira slipped through the wire and into the darkness. The desert swallowed her whole and the hunt began. The stalk took 8 hours. 8 hours to cover 1,400 meters of broken ground, moving with such care that each step took 3 minutes of careful placement, weight testing, camouflage adjustment. 8 hours of becoming part of the landscape, of erasing herself from the world. Her mother had taught her this, translating her father's field notes. The art of disappearing. The discipline of patience so complete it became a kind of meditation. By 1100 she had reached her primary observation point, a depression between 2 rock formations that offered concealment and clear sight lines to 3 suspected enemy zones. She set up her hide with movements so small they would be invisible to observation. Camouflage netting, range cards, backup firing positions planned and memorized. Then the waiting began. Hour 1. The sun climbed, heat building, temperature rising toward 110 degrees. Hour 2, sweat soaking her ghillie suit. Water discipline critical. Small sips, not enough to satisfy, just enough to survive. Hour 3. Her mind wanted to wander to thoughts of her father, of the man who'd built this rifle while thinking about her. She brought it back to focus, scanning, reading mirage, tracking wind indicators, the way dust moved, the way heat shimmer, bent light. Hour 4, movement, eastern Wadi, 1,640 meters distant. Through her scope, she saw a figure setting up. Professional movements, taking time to construct a hide. Too obvious, too visible. This was bait. Kira didn't shoot, kept scanning, trusting the training her mother had drilled into her. If you see something too perfect, look for what you're not seeing. Hour 5. The heat was brutal now. 114 degrees. The rifle metal almost too hot to touch. She used a cloth to insulate her hand exactly as her father's notes had specified. Hour 6. There. Thermal mirage barely visible. Behind and above the eastern Wadi position in a depression that wouldn't be visible from Cop Sanctuary. 1,720 meters away. Real target. Professional hide. Excellent concealment. Through her scope, she could see him now. Male, approximately 30 years old, professional equipment. SVD Dragunov with modern optics. He'd been there for hours, maybe days. Waiting. Kira ranged him. 1,724 meters. Difficult shot, but makeable. Her father's rifle was built for this. Wind 16 miles per hour, shifting between east and southeast. Temperature 112 Fahrenheit. Humidity 8%. She ran the calculations in her head, numbers flowing automatically after years of practice under her mother's instruction. Bullet drop 686 inches. Wind drift 94 inches left. Spin drift 9 inches right. Coriolis effect 3.2 inches right. Total hold 47 MOA elevation, 14 MOA left wind. She settled into shooting position, controlled breathing, natural respiratory pause, finger on trigger. But something stopped her. Why would a professional expose himself like that after hours of perfect discipline? She pulled away from the scope, scanned the periphery with naked eye. There, secondary position. 580 meters to her southwest. Elevated 20 meters. Thermal shimmer barely visible. He wasn't alone. The sniper at 1,720 meters was bait. The real shooter was hunting her. The professional had anticipated that Cop Sanctuary would send their best, and he'd set a trap specifically designed for a trained counter-sniper. Kira rolled left just as a bullet cracked through where her head had been missed by 3 inches. Second shot impact on her rock cover fragments, cutting her face. She scrambled behind the boulder, breathing hard, bleeding. The trap had been set for her all along, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she heard her mother's voice channeling her father's lessons. When you're pinned, Kira, the enemy has made a choice about where you are. That gives you information. Use it. Kira pressed herself against the boulder, her heart hammering, blood trickling down her cheek from the rock fragments. The rifle felt heavy in her hands, not from its weight, but from the sudden understanding of how badly she'd underestimated her opponent. He'd known someone would come. He'd prepared for it. Set up a perfect counter-ambush with himself as the hunter and the bait positioned just far enough away to make any shooter focus on the wrong target. Professional, methodical. Exactly like her father had described the Soviet snipers he'd faced. Her radio was clipped to her vest, but she didn't dare move to key it. Any shift in position would expose her to the shooter at 580 meters. He had perfect overwatch of her hide, waiting for her to make a mistake. Stalemate. Kira's mind raced through options. She couldn't stay here, the sun was moving, and in another hour her position would be in full sunlight, eliminating what little concealment she had. She couldn't retreat without exposing herself to fire. She couldn't advance. All she could do was wait and think. Training older than conscious thought took over her father's lessons, embedded so deep they felt like instinct. When you're pinned, Kira, the enemy has made a choice about where you are. That gives you information. Use it. She risked a quick glance around the boulder's edge, pulled back immediately as another round cracked past, closer this time. But she'd seen enough. The shooter was positioned on a ridge partial defilade behind rocks. SVD Dragunov based on the sound. Professional optics. He'd shoot every time she showed herself disciplined and patient. But discipline created patterns, and patterns could be exploited. Hour 7. The temperature climbed to 118. Kira's water was running low. She took tiny sips, just enough to keep her functional. Her mind went to her father sitting in a hide just like this, pinned by a Spetsnaz sniper, thinking about a daughter he'd never meet, refusing to quit because that daughter was waiting at home. If he could do it while imagining her, she could do it while remembering him. Hour 8. Kira's hands moved slowly, carefully constructing a decoy. Her helmet draped with ghillie material to approximate a human form, a stick to raise it above cover. It wouldn't fool anyone for long, but it didn't need to. She just needed a fraction of a second. One chance. One shot. If she missed, she died. But her father had faced the same calculation, and he'd taken the shot. Kira positioned the decoy, took 3 deep breaths to slow her heart rate, and counted down. 3, 2, 1. She raised the decoy slowly from behind the boulder. The enemy's shot came instantly, the helmet spinning away a clean hit. But in the muzzle flash for exactly zero point 0.4 seconds, Kira saw him. Position confirmed. 587 meters elevated ridge, partial defilade behind rocks. She had her target. Now came the impossible part. Kira needed to break from cover, acquire the target, and fire before the enemy could chamber his next round and engage. SV-D Dragunov cycle time for an experienced shooter approximately 1.2 seconds. Her window 1.2 seconds to move, acquire, and kill. She counted down her breathing. Found the calm space her mother had taught her, the space her father had described in his notes, where fear existed but didn't control. Where death was possible but not inevitable. Where perfect commitment meant more than perfect conditions. 3, 2, 1. Kira exploded from cover, rifle already coming up to her shoulder. The world moved in fragments of perception. Enemy's face in her crosshairs, older than she'd thought, weathered professional. Eyes widening in recognition of her movement. Hands working the bolt, chambering the round that would kill her. She didn't think, didn't calculate, just trusted 27 years of preparation, of muscle memory her mother had built through 10,000 repetitions, channeling a father's knowledge. Her finger pressed the trigger. Both rifles fired simultaneously. His bullet missed, left close enough that she felt the pressure wave against her neck. Her bullet, fired from the rifle her father had built for this exact purpose, struck center mass at 587 meters. The enemy sniper dropped. Kira maintained aim, scanning for the spotter at 1,720 meters. Movement, the spotter breaking from his hide, running. Moving target, 1,730 meters, running perpendicular to her position. The calculations came automatically, muscle memory from years of practice. Speed approximately 15 miles per hour. Wind 16 miles per hour from southeast. Temperature 112. Lead by 42 inches. Elevation 47 MOA. Adjust for lateral movement and wind drift. She fired. 1,730 meters distant, the spotter tumbled and went still. Kira's hands were shaking now, adrenaline crashing through her system. She keyed her radio with trembling fingers. Sanctuary, this is Thorn. 2 enemy KIA. Primary threat at 587 meters, secondary at 1730. Threat neutralized. Captain Cross's voice came back immediately. Confirmed kills at those ranges. Thorn 1730 meters on a moving target is... I know what it is, ma'am. Target down. Moving to confirm. Kira approached the first body with her rifle ready, every sense alert. The man lay where he'd fallen, sprawled across the rocks. She could see now he was older than she'd thought, maybe 35-40. Chechen features, professional gear that spoke of military training that went deeper than insurgent standard. In his pocket, she found a military identification card, Cyrillic text, and photographs. A woman, beautiful, smiling. 2 little girls, maybe 8 and 5 years old, holding dolls. Kira's stomach turned. This man had a family, had daughters who would grow up without a father, the same way she had. She took his dog tags. They identified him as Sergeant Viktor Kozlov, Russian Federation Armed Forces. Spetsnaz insignia. The confirmation of what Mackenzie had suspected. The second body was younger, maybe 25. Less equipment, clearly subordinate. Syrian based on the documents she found. Kira stood between 2 corpses in the Iraqi desert and felt the full weight of what her father had carried for years. Not the physical act of killing that was clean mechanical, a function of training and geometry, but the after. The knowing that she had erased futures, created widows and orphans, become the source of grief for people she would never meet. Her father had carried this weight. Mackenzie had told her that. She understood why now. But the alternative was 7 more dead Marines, 22 trapped at some distant outpost, a convoy destroyed in an ambush. The weight was the cost of the gift. You carried both or you carried neither. Her father had understood that. Had carried it while thinking about a daughter he'd never meet. Had built her this rifle knowing she might someday face the same choice. He'd given her the tools, the skills, the weapon. But he'd also given her the example of how to carry the weight. Kira radioed in her position and began the long walk back to COP Sanctuary. The sun was setting by the time she walked through the wire. Captain Cross met her at the gate, and for a moment neither woman spoke. Finally, Cross said, 1,730 meters, on a moving target, in 112-degree heat. She shook her head slowly. Thorne, that's exceptional shooting. Your father would be— He had daughters, Kira said quietly, interrupting. Kozlov, 2 of them. Just like I'm a daughter who grew up without a father. I know. They all do. Cross's voice carried the weight of someone who'd been here before. That's the cost. You can refuse to pay it and watch Marines die. Or you can pay it and live with the weight. There's no third option. Your father learned that. Now you have too. Inside the TOC, Kira gave her full debrief. Positions, ranges, equipment, tactics. Everything documented with the clinical precision her father had designed into his methodology. When she finished, Cross said, get some sleep. You've been in the field for 16 hours. But sleep was impossible. Kira lay in her assigned bunk and stared at the ceiling, seeing Viktor Kozlov's face in her scope, seeing his daughters who would never see their father again, seeing her own reflection in that grief. At 0200, she gave up on sleep and walked to the outpost perimeter. The desert stretched away under starlight, beautiful and deadly and indifferent to human suffering. Your father used to stand here too. Kira turned. Cross had approached silently, carrying 2 cups of coffee that smelled like it had been brewed sometime during the previous war. After his duel with the Soviet sniper, Cross continued handing Kira a cup. He stood right here for 3 hours, just looking at the desert. Finally, I asked him what he was thinking about. What did he say? He said he was thinking about the man he'd killed, wondering if he had family, wondering if those skills, the gift he'd been given, made him a warrior, or just made him good at creating widows. Cross sipped her coffee. He never resolved it, just learned to carry both possibilities at once. He told me that's what he hoped to teach his child someday, how to carry the weight without letting it crush you. They stood in silence, drinking terrible coffee and watching the stars. You did something extraordinary today, Cross said finally. 1,730 meters in combat conditions. That's going into the record books. But I know that's not what you're thinking about. I'm thinking I've become exactly what I was trying to avoid, which is my father's daughter, the sniper, the one who carries the weight he carried, the one who creates the same grief he created. Cross was quiet for a long moment. Your father told me something the night before his duel. He said the hardest part about becoming a parent was knowing your child might inherit both your gifts and your burdens. He couldn't give you one without the other, so the best he could do was build you the tools to carry both well. Cross looked at her. He built you that rifle. He left you his notebooks. He gave you everything he had, even though he never got to meet you. Seems like he succeeded. Kira felt tears burning her eyes. I wish I could have known him. Could have asked him if the wait was worth it. I think you know the answer. 7 Marines are alive at this outpost because you carried the weight today. Your father saved dozens of lives over his career. The weight is terrible. But the alternative, letting good people die when you have the skills to save them, that weight is worse. 24 hours later, Colonel Mackenzie arrived at COP Sanctuary via helicopter. He found Kira on the firing range running drills with her rifle, even though the threat was eliminated. Lieutenant Thorne, walk with me. They moved to a quiet corner of the outpost away from listening ears. Congratulations on eliminating Kozlov. He was a Tier 1 threat. Signals intelligence confirms he was training insurgent sniper cells across Ambar province. You didn't just save this outpost, you degraded enemy capability across the entire sector. Thank you, sir. Mackenzie pulled out a folder. Which brings me to why I'm here. New tasking, time-sensitive, critical priority. Kira's stomach tightened. She could see where this was going. Afghanistan, Hindu Kush Mountains, Marine platoon trapped at Observation Post Phoenix. 22 Marines, sir, surrounded by approximately 80 Taliban fighters. Terrain makes conventional rescue impossible. 300-meter cliffs, single approach covered by heavy machine guns. Weather's keeping air support grounded. He spread photos across a table. Satellite imagery of impossible terrain elevation charts that made Kira's head spin. They need precision overwatch to suppress enemy positions before ground element can extract. Mackenzie looked at her steadily. The primary target Taliban command post is at extreme distance, beyond anything you've attempted in combat. How far, sir? I'll brief you with the full package before insertion. But Kira, his voice dropped. Your father's record was 1876 meters. This mission will require you to exceed that, significantly. Kira felt ice in her stomach. By how much? Enough that I wouldn't ask if there was any other option. Mountain environment, high altitude, variable wind, extreme cold. He pulled out another photo, this one showing the trapped Marines' young faces tight with fear and exhaustion. Lieutenant Harris is 23, Corporal Martinez is 20. Private First Class Chen just turned 19. They're someone's sons, someone's brothers. They deserve our best effort. Kira looked at those young faces and saw her father at their age. Saw herself at 19 before she'd understood what legacy really meant. What if I miss? What if I make the shot and it's not enough? Then they die anyway, but at least they die knowing we sent our best. Mackenzie leaned forward. Your father built that rifle for this, Kira, for the impossible shot, for the moment when everything else has failed and there's only one chance left. This is that moment. When do I leave? 72 hours. You'll train at extended range here, then insert via halo jump into the Hindu Kush. The next 3 days blurred together in an intensive preparation cycle. Kira pushed her rifle to maximum effective range, setting targets at 2,000 meters, 2,200, 2,400, testing the limits of her father's design and her own skills. She made the shots, but barely. In controlled conditions with unlimited time with no enemy fire. Combat would add layers of complexity that could turn barely possible into impossible. Captain Cross helped her prep, sharing everything she knew about mountain shooting. Altitude thins the air, less resistance means flatter trajectory, but also less bullet stability. Cold affects powder burn rate. Wind in mountain passes can shift 30 degrees in 30 seconds. So basically everything I know needs to be recalculated. Everything you know needs to be doubled and then adapted on the fly. Cross-checked Kira's gear. Your father faced impossible conditions in Kuwait. Burning oil fields created updrafts that shifted wind patterns constantly. He adapted. So will you. On the final night before deployment, Kira sat alone with her father's rifle and the letter he'd written to his unborn child. Her mother had given it to her on her 18th birthday. She'd read it 100 times, but tonight the words hit differently. To my child, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're old enough to understand what this rifle means. I built it in 1989, before you were born, before I knew if you'd be son or daughter. Your mother told me she's pregnant 3 days before I wrote this. I deployed before knowing your name or seeing your face. I may never come home, but I wanted you to have this, not because I want you to become what I am, but because I want you to be prepared for whatever life demands. My longest shot was 1,876 meters. I'll die thinking that was my limit. I hope you prove limits are just starting points. Don't hide from greatness because it scares you. Don't hide from legacy because it's heavy. Be better than I was. Reach further than I reached. That's what legacies are for. I love you. I'll always love you, even if I never get to meet you. Your father, Brennan Thorne. Kira folded the letter carefully and placed it back in her pocket. Then she picked up the rifle and spoke to her father across 35 years and 10,000 miles. I'm going to try, Dad. I'm going to make a shot you never could. Not because I'm better than you, but because you gave me the foundation to build higher. She placed her hand on the rifle stock, feeling the wood her father had shaped and sanded and fitted to measurements for a child he'd only dreamed about. I'm scared, but I'm going anyway. I think that's what you were trying to teach me all along. Mom did a good job passing on your lessons. I wish you could have taught me yourself, but I'll do my best to honor what you left behind. The Hindu Kush Mountains rose like the bones of the earth itself, jagged peaks clawing at thin air at altitudes where breathing became work. Kira and her spotter Staff Sergeant Marla Vance descended through darkness after their halo insertion, landing in a snowfield at 12,000 feet elevation. The cold hit like a physical blow. -18 Fahrenheit. So cold that metal burned skin, that breath froze in the air, that every movement had to be calculated against the energy cost of generating body heat. They had 6 hours to reach their observation position before dawn. 6 hours to cover terrain that would kill them if they made a single mistake, a slip on ice, a misstep on loose scree, a wrong turn into a crevasse hidden under snow. Vance moved like a ghost ahead of her, experienced in mountain operations. Kira followed her father's rifle strapped across her back, every breath a reminder of how thin the air was at this altitude. By 0500, they'd reached the ridge Mackenzie had identified. A narrow platform of rock overlooking the valley where Observation Post Phoenix sat surrounded and dying. Kira set up her position while Vance established communications with the trapped platoon. Phoenix, this is Overwatch. We're in position. The response came back, young voice, tight with exhaustion. Overwatch, this is Lieutenant Harris. We've got maybe 8 hours of ammunition left. After that, we're out. Kira glassed the valley through her scope. The observation post was a cluster of mud brick buildings surrounded by Taliban positions on 3 sides. Machine gun nests, RPG teams. Command post. She ranged the primary target, the Taliban command position, 2,367 meters. The number hung in her mind like a sentence, 2367. Kira's breath caught. She ranged it again, certain she'd made an error. 2,367 meters. Vance, her voice was tight. Confirm this range. Vance checked her rangefinder. Confirmed, 2367 meters to primary target. Mackenzie said extreme distance. He didn't say impossible distance. Kira's hands were shaking. This is 500 meters beyond my father's record. In mountains, in sub-zero cold, with variable wind. Can you make it? The question hung in the frozen air. This wasn't just exceeding her father's record, it was attempting something no human had ever confirmed in combat. Nearly 1.5 miles, at an elevation where air pressure was 2/3 of sea level, in negative 15-degree cold, with wind gusting between 18 and 25 miles per hour through mountain passes. I don't know, Kira said honestly, but 22 Marines are about to find out. Talk me through the calculation, Vance said quietly. Kira pulled out her data book, began running numbers that seemed impossible. Range 2367 meters, elevation gain 390 meters, slope angle 9.4 degrees. Wind, Vance checked her Kestrel weather meter. 21 miles per hour, average gusting to 26. Direction 285 degrees, but its channeling through that pass could shift 15 degrees either way without warning. Temperature negative 15 Fahrenheit. That's going to slow your powder burn significantly. Calculating 48 feet per second velocity loss. Kira's fingers worked through the math her mother had taught her, calculations her father had developed. Barometric pressure, 22.9 inches, extreme altitude. She ran the full calculation, her mind processing variables her father had trained her mother to teach. Bullet drop 1,089 inches, 90 feet. Her bullet had to arc 9 stories high to reach the target. Wind drift 168 inches left, 14 feet. Coriolis drift 5.4 inches right. Spin drift 15 inches right. Vertical wind component from valley updraft 12 inches. Total hold 54 MOA, elevation 24 MOA left wind. Vance, my margin of error at this range is maybe 3 inches. One wind gust at the wrong moment, and I miss by feet. Can you make the shot? Kira thought about her father missing twice before making his record shot. Thought about the 3 days he'd spent in that hide learning and adapting. Thinking about a daughter he'd never meet. I can try. That's all he could do. It's all anyone can do. Through her scope, she watched the Taliban commander organizing his forces for what looked like a final assault. Young man, maybe 30, moving with authority and confidence. Lieutenant Harris's voice crackled over the radio. Overwatch, they're preparing to attack. If you're going to shoot, it needs to be now. Kira settled into her firing position. Controlled her breathing despite the thin air that made every breath feel insufficient. Found the calm center her father had described in his letters, the place her mother had taught her to find. Her finger rested on the trigger, and she froze. Not from fear, from mathematics, from the cold understanding that this shot was beyond documented human capability in these conditions, that her father had never attempted anything like this, that she was about to try something that might simply be impossible. Vance's voice quiet beside her thumb. Your father missed his first 2 shots at the Soviet sniper. You know why he kept trying? Why, because Marines were dying while he figured it out. Because your mother was home waiting for him. Because he'd made a promise to come home. Vance adjusted the spotting scope. You've got one advantage he didn't have. What's that? He built you to be better than him. This rifle, these skills, everything he left behind, it was all designed for you to reach further than he ever could. So reach further. Kira took a breath, released it, found her natural respiratory pause. Thought about her father and his hide missing, twice trying again anyway. Thought about the letter in her pocket, reach further than I reached. Thought about 22 Marines who would die if she didn't try. And fired. The rifle cracked. The bullet left the barrel at 2,820 feet per second, already beginning its long arc through thin mountain air. 3.9 seconds of flight time. Kira held her breath, watching through the scope. The bullet impacted 13 inches high of the target. Miss, the Taliban commander dropped to cover alive and moving to hard cover. Damn it, Kira worked the bolt, chambering a fresh round. Vertical wind was stronger than I calculated. Updraft from the valley added more lift. He's moving to that rock outcrop. You have got maybe 12 seconds before he's behind hard cover. Kira's mind raced. Recalculate. Adjust. Trust the training. Reduce elevation by 1 MOA. Account for stronger updraft. Trust the wind reading. 10 seconds. She found the commander in her scope moving fast, almost to safety. 8 seconds. Her father's words from the letter. When you know, don't think. Become the rifle. 6 seconds. Kira fired. The world held its breath for 3.9 seconds. 2,367 meters away, across a mile and a half of mountain air, through wind and cold, and the limits of human capability, the bullet fired from the rifle her father had built found its target. The Taliban commander dropped. Final. Vance's voice was hushed. Confirmed kill, 2,367 meters. Kira, that's a world record. That's the longest confirmed combat kill in history. But there was no time for celebration. Machine gun nests were still operational. Taliban fighters were recovering from the shock of seeing their commander killed by a ghost they couldn't see. Kira shifted to the next target. Machine gun nest alpha, 2190 meters. She made the calculation faster now, trusting her initial wind reading, adjusting only for the range difference. Fired. Gunner down. Work the bolt. Assistant gunner down. She worked through the targets with mechanical precision. Machine gun nest Bravo gunner down, assistant down. RPG team Charlie shooter eliminated before he could fire. Every pull of the trigger bought the trapped Marines seconds they desperately needed. Additional fighters at ranges between 2,100 and 2,300 meters. 13 confirmed kills in 6 minutes 40 seconds. The Taliban position collapsed. Survivors fled. Rescue helicopters swept in, extracted all 22 Marines safely. Lieutenant Harris's voice over the radio breaking with emotion. Overwatch, I don't know how you made those shots, but you just saved 22 lives. Thank you. Kira saved her rifle with trembling hands. The adrenaline crash hit her like a physical blow. Vance was staring at her. Do you understand what you just did? 2,367 meters in mountain environment, extreme cold variable wind. That shot is going to be studied in every sniper school on Earth. Kira examined her father's rifle, noticed for the first time an inscription she'd never seen inside the trigger guard, so small she needed her scope to read it. KT, reach further, BT, 1989. KT Kira Thorne. Her father had engraved her initials the year she was born, months before his death. He'd built this rifle for her specifically, had known her name, had prepared this weapon for her to reach further than he'd reached. He knew my name, she whispered. He knew I was coming. He built this for me. And you just proved he was right to believe in you, Vance said softly. The helicopter extraction felt dreamlike. Kira sat with her father's rifle across her lap, Vance beside her, flying away from mountains that had almost killed them. Her satellite phone buzzed. Mackenzie's voice. Lieutenant Thorne, I'm reading confirmed kill at 2,367 meters. Please confirm. Confirmed, sir. World record shot. Long silence on the other end. Your father would be, Mackenzie's voice broke. Kira, he'd be so damn proud. You didn't just beat his record. You proved limits are starting points. You proved his legacy was a foundation, not a ceiling. You proved he was right to build that rifle for you. He knew my name, sir. I found his inscription. He knew who I was before I existed. He knew. He loved you before he met you. And he built you that rifle believing you'd exceed everything he'd done. Mackenzie paused. Welcome home, Lieutenant. Your father's been waiting 35 years for you to reach this far. Kira returned to Al Ramadi 3 weeks after the Hindu Kush mission. The base looked the same dust, same heat, same Marines going about their work. But something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding from a ghost anymore. Hollis met her at the flight line, and for a moment they just looked at each other, two people who'd started as adversaries and ended as something closer to friends. 2,367 meters, he said finally. The whole Corps is talking about it. Hell, the whole military is talking about it. It was just math and wind reading, Staff Sergeant. Bullshit. Hollis's voice was rough but not unkind. It was you finally being who you were meant to be all along. It was you honoring your father by exceeding him. Bramford appeared grinning like an idiot. Lieutenant, or should I say living legend. How about just Kira? Works for me. Bramford pulled out his phone. My sister wants to talk to you. Says you proved her theory about people hiding their power. Your sister is terrifying. She really is. Major Reynolds found her that evening in the chow hall. He sat down across from her without asking permission. I recommended you for Silver Star, he said quietly. 22 Marines alive because of you, record-breaking marksmanship under impossible conditions. You earned it. Sir, I was just using what my father left me. Don't. Reynolds held up a hand. Don't minimize what you did. Your father left you the tools. You did the work. You made the impossible shot. He built the rifle knowing I'd need to reach further than he did. He prepared for this before I was born. And that makes what you did even more remarkable. Reynolds leaned forward. You're being reassigned. Scout Sniper School as instructor. They want you teaching the next generation. When 30 days, enough time to say your goodbyes here. After he left, Kira walked to the outpost perimeter and called her mother on the sat phone. Kira, her mother's voice broke immediately. I heard. Colonel Mackenzie called me. He said you made a shot your father never could have imagined. I made the shot. He built the rifle for Mom. He prepared for this. He knew my name. He engraved it inside the rifle. He loved you before you were born, sweetheart. He talked about you every day after I told him I was pregnant. Wondered what you'd be like. Hoped you'd be better than him. I wish I could have met him. Could have heard his voice. Could have asked him if the weight was worth carrying. You know the answer, baby. You carried it to save 22 lives. He carried it to save dozens more. The weight is terrible, but it's the price of the gift. Her mother paused. He'd be so proud of you, Kira, not just for the shot, for finally accepting who you are. They talked for an hour about the rifle, the record, the weight of legacy finally becoming a foundation instead of a burden. When they hung up, Kira felt lighter than she had in 27 years. The 30 days passed in a blur of routine convoy runs and quiet conversations with the Marines she'd served with. On her final night, Hollis organized an informal gathering, just the convoy unit, some beer, some terrible food. To Lieutenant Thorne, Hollis raised his bottle. Who taught us that the quietest person in the room might be the most dangerous? Who saved our asses more times than we probably know about? And who proved that legacy isn't about matching the past, it's about building on it? To Thorne, the unit echoed. Kira stood bottle in hand, looking at faces that had become familiar. I came here trying to be invisible, trying to serve without comparison. You made that impossible, and I'm grateful for that. You forced me to stop running from a father I never knew and start honoring what he left behind. 18 months later, Kira stood before her first class at Marine Corps Scout Sniper School. 18 students, 12 men, 6 women, all young and scared, sat in front of her in the classroom. She placed her father's rifle on the table, the custom build that had made the impossible shot. This rifle was built in 1989 by Master Gunnery Sergeant Brennan Thorne. He built it for his unborn child. He died in a training accident 3 months before I was born, rushing home to meet me. He never knew my face, never heard my voice, but he knew my name, and he built this rifle for me to use. The students leaned forward. His longest confirmed kill, 1,876 meters. Kuwait, 1991. For 27 years, I thought that was a ceiling I'd never reach. She paused. My longest confirmed kill, 2,367 meters. Afghanistan, Hindu Kush Mountains, 2008. I thought it was impossible. Here's what I learned. Legacies aren't ceilings. They're foundations. My father didn't build this rifle for me to match him. He built it so I could go further. He gave me the tools and the skills so I could prove limits are just starting points. After class dismissed, a young lieutenant approached, female, nervous, carrying herself like someone who'd been underestimated her whole life. Ma'am, my father was a scout sniper. He died in Fallujah. I'm terrified I'll never be as good as he was. Kira saw herself in those words, the weight, the fear, the impossible standard. Let me tell you something, she said gently. Your father didn't train you to be him. He trained you to be better. That's what good fathers do, even the ones who die before their children are born. They build foundations so their children can reach heights they never imagined. But what if I'm not good enough? Then you keep trying until you are. That's what I did. My father missed his first shots too. Being good enough isn't about perfection. It's about refusing to quit when it matters. She pulled out the photograph she always carried, her father in desert camouflage, Desert Storm, 1991. Young man with old eyes thinking about a daughter he'd never meet. He believed in me before I existed. Built me a rifle before he knew my face. Left me everything I needed to exceed him. Kira handed the photo to the young lieutenant. Your father did the same for you. Don't dishonor that by trying to match him. Honor it by being better. That evening, Kira drove to Quantico's long-range course. The sun was setting, painting the Virginia hills in gold and amber. She set up a target at 2,500 meters, further than Afghanistan. Further than anyone, one round, one shot. For the girl who'd spent 27 years hiding. For the father who'd believed in someone he'd never meet. For the weight she'd finally learned to carry with pride instead of shame. She calculated the hold, rayed the wind, found her pause, fired. 2,500 meters distant, the target sang. Perfect. Kira lowered her rifle and looked at the inscription inside the trigger guard. KT, reach further, BT, 1989. I did, Dad, she whispered, and I'll teach them to reach further still. The sun dipped below the hills. Somewhere behind her, new students were studying ballistics tables and wind charts beginning the journey she'd completed. Lieutenant Kira Thorne, no longer the ghost driver, no longer hiding, no longer running from a legacy that had terrified her, finally understood what her father had known all along. The greatest gift wasn't the rifle. It wasn't the skills. It wasn't even the record shots. The greatest gift was permission. Permission to be extraordinary. Permission to exceed limits. Permission to build higher than those who came before. Permission to reach further than anyone thought possible. Her father had given her that permission before she was born, before he knew her face, before he could speak her name aloud. He'd built her a rifle and left her a legacy and died trying to reach her. And now she would spend the rest of her life giving that same permission to others. One impossible shot at a time. One student at a time. One generation at a time. The ghost driver had become a legend. But more importantly, she'd become herself. And in becoming herself, she'd finally met the father she'd never known, not in person, but in purpose. In the rifle he'd built, in the skills he'd preserved, in the permission he'd given, in the foundation he'd laid for her to reach further than he ever could. She whispered one final goodbye to the man who'd loved her before she existed. Thank you for building me wings, Dad. I'll make sure they carry the next generation even higher. The wind carried her words away, across the range, across the years, across the distance between a daughter who'd finally found herself and a father who'd believed in her all along. And somewhere in the fading light, Kira could almost hear him answer. There's my girl. I knew you would remember. I knew you'd reach further. I'm proud of you, Kira. I always was.